I'm Joe Bartlett. I'm with Fitzgerald Environmental. We're out of Colchester, Vermont, so up near Burlington. And as Marie was saying, we've done a lot of stream geomorphic work, and a lot of that has been post-Irene focused down in southern Vermont. And so we were really hot and heavy in 2013, 14, 15, doing a lot of the big river basins. So we did like the Williams River, Millbrook. Before Irene, we did White River, and then there was a bit of a slowdown on stream geomorphic assessments for a little while, and then the state has been prioritizing getting some of the ones reassessed or finished in some of the larger basins that were done previously. So this project was funded through Vermont DEC, and then with support, we also worked with Wyndham Regional Commission, and then we're down at the bottom there. And so sort of a simple agenda. I'm going to go through a little bit of background on river science and talk about sort of flooding as it pertains to the region and then to this area specifically. Then I will go into sort of the methods and the results of the geomorphic assessment. And then we're going to talk about the projects that came out of it and then sort of general discussion at the end. So the first couple slides I have are looking at some of the new national and regional analyses that explain some of the things that we're seeing. And so the National Climate Assessment was just released. This is data up through 2021. And the one really important figure, I know it's kind of hard to see, but the two important figures are that the total rainfall that's happening on the heaviest 1% of days is up significantly. Like there's 60% more rainfall happening on the heaviest 3 days of the year, and in this region. And then also the bigger storms, the 5-year storms are larger, and then also just sort of the annual maximum daily. And so the biggest storm of the year is also, everything is just higher, and that's all in the last, I think that's looking at the last 5 years compared to the historical data.
But these are maximum events. You're not saying rainfall has increased. It's just
correct.
When it rains harder.
Yes, the total annual rainfall is actually fairly stable. There's more variability year to year than historically, but it's still pretty much the same. But the thing that is noticeable is that we used to have a lot more half-inch rains. And now we have drought for 3 weeks, 2 inches of rain. Drought for 2 weeks, inch of rain. And so the rainfall patterns have changed significantly. This is a figure from the Vermont Climate Assessment, and the updated version is happening right now. So it will be a new version will be released soon, but this is data through 2020. And it basically just shows the number of days per decade, or the number of days per year based on decades where we have more than 1 inch of rain in a day. And so it used to be 5-6 days a year. Now it's 8 to 9 days a year. And I know for a fact that in 2023, I think it was 14 or 15. So we're just getting more of these bigger storms. And at least in Vermont, in the regulatory world, the 1 inch rainstorm is kind of where stormwater regulations come in, because that's where you start to get significant runoff. And then this graph, this looks at the nationwide, the damage from floods, and then so as you would expect from the 90s to 2020, it's increased quite a bit. But the interesting thing is the lower portion, the green area, that is what they are estimating as what has come from increased precipitation. So solidly a third of the damages, the increase in damages is because we're just getting more heavy rain. So all of these things, all these trends are going up. So what we've seen the last few years, what we've seen since Irene, there's no reason to think that it's gonna go back to the way that it was. And there's reason to be worried that we're gonna continue to have these really big events more frequently than we're supposed to. And then this is a figure, this is in kind of all the hydrology textbooks, where this one sort of tells an important story for the West River watershed and for a lot of the watersheds in Vermont that are at the scale of the West River. Floodplains historically are where we've built stuff. And so the dark blue line sort of shows water coming in from upstream, And then the blue dashed line shows what happens to that water if you have good floodplains. If you don't have good floodplains because of encroachment, which I will talk about a lot later, you get higher flows. And so the landscape doesn't have as much room to absorb that water and to store it and slow it down. And so the water just keeps coming down the river systems faster and gets higher and causes more damage. Come on, there we go. These are going to be probably pretty hard for everyone to see, but these are just some pictures I took of the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program mapping within the West River watershed. And there are a lot of areas where everything is just completely pinched. And that's right outside this meeting. I think this picture is right over there. And that's true for a lot of the West River watershed. There's just no floodplain. And so that is the 100-year flood, the 500-year flood. It is all contained between the two roads that are on both sides of the river. And then much further upstream, up in Landgrove, the Landgrove Town Hall is just off the top of that picture, I believe. There actually are some floodplains. And so that's a spot where you see the 100-year flood going out. And the channel is only 20 feet wide there, but the floodplain is 500 feet wide. And so that's kind of more what you would want to see when the setting's appropriate. Obviously, you could never have a 500-foot wide floodplain right here, but there would be more floodplain than there is now. And then this is just, I'm sure that you have all seen and lived through it, but this is just one of the pictures. This is up in Weston, and there's basically no floodplains between Weston and Londonderry, so all of that water came right down here and had nowhere else to go. Certainly nowhere to go where it didn't cause problems. And then, sorry. Yeah, the picture slides take a while to advance. And then, sort of the aftermath of these storms is you get these channels, especially some of the smaller, well, they're not small, but the 40-foot wide tributaries that are coming down and coming into the west just get completely blasted out. And they have become 100 feet wide, 200 feet wide of just rock. And there's no soil, there's no roots, there's no anything. The river hasn't, even to this date, it's been quite a while since Irene when some of these got hit really hard, and then it happened all again in 2023. Rivers need a long time to sort of reestablish a stable condition. And so a lot of these systems that are steeper are going to look like this for a long time. And because they look like this, they're going to keep washing sand, gravel, cobbles into the West River. Question?
That's on the Ball Mountain Brook.
Yes. But I've been on at least 4 tributaries that are equally or worse destroyed than Ball Mountain Brook. And so, sort of just a quick summary of what we did and I guess why we did it. So this is gonna be really hard to see. This is the entire West River watershed. Previous studies looked at some of the tributaries in the southern portion of the watershed and at some parts of the main stem. The stream geomorphic assessment methodology does not work when there are dams. So the dam areas always get kind of skipped. But then this shows our study area, also going to be hard to see. We looked at a few miles of the main stem in between Ball Mountain Dam and the Townsend Dam. And then we picked up once you got above the effect area of the Ball Mountain Dam, which isn't too far down from here. That's where we started. And then we did the main stem all the way up pretty close to the top of Weston. So we did all that. And then we looked at the portions of several of the tributaries, which, I can talk with we did a very small amount of the Winhall River. That was required by the state because it's a stretch just up in the National Forest that's really important to them because they've been doing decades of monitoring of water chemistry, of bugs, of fish up there. And so they also wanted us to look at that. And that area was done in a previous assessment right after Irene. And then everything else we did was new. This had not been previously assessed. So we looked at a good amount of Thompsonburg Brook, a small portion of Flood Brook, a very small portion of Farnham Brook, most of Utley Brook, which starts right in downtown Londonderry, or I guess ends in Duntown Londonderry, and then a little bit of Jones Brook, which is a tributary to Utley Brook. It was 29 reaches, and a reach is it's a defined length that comes through this methodology where you're trying to pick a section of the river, and it can be any length. We have reaches that are 2-3 miles long. We have some that are 800 feet long. But it's supposed to be a spot that is relatively consistent, both in what the river is doing now and what the river wants to be doing if it was stable. So things that would cause a reach break would be a major tributary coming in, a major change in slope, going from no bedrock to bedrock, a change in the width of the valley. If it's a kind of winding flat channel into a steep bedrocky channel, that would be a reach break. And so it was 34 river miles over 29 reaches. And then, so basically what we do is we work downstream to upstream. I'm not sure if that's really in the methodology, if that's just how we do it, but basically get there in the morning, strap on your waders, pack your water and your lunch, and you just slowly walk up the channel. And I did include one kayak picture because we did kayak the stretch above the Williams Dam, but other than that, it was all walking. And you kind of just walk up the river. We have a GPS, we have camera, we have a laser rangefinder, we have measuring tapes, and we document any features that sort of indicate what the river is doing. So we record the location, the length, the height of features like bank erosion, of riprap. We look at if there are any features that are showing that the channel is moving, so channel migration. We categorize the floodplain accessibility and the quality. We look at what the substrate is in the channel, and that's really important for West River because substrate size versus the shape and the slope of the channel determines whether or not that substrate moves. And that's one of the things that we notice a lot is that you get these spots where the substrate's too small. And so that means that those rocks aren't going to stay, every year you're gonna have a flood where all those rocks move. And that is bad for infrastructure, that's bad for the downstream areas, that's tough on fish and bugs. So that's an important thing we look at. We look at the riparian buffer vegetation. We look at development and agriculture and roadway encroachment within the river valley. We count every piece of wood in the channel that's bigger than 6 inches in diameter, which in more natural settings can be hundreds of pieces per mile. In the West River, it was usually 5 pieces per day. There's just not a lot of wood in the West River because it all got blasted out. It gets blasted out. And some areas had more wood, but there was not. And also the West River, it's a big river. This is right up there with the biggest rivers that I think are appropriate for the SGA method. Until you get up kind of above, close to Weston is about where it gets down into a size that's more standard for what we do. But the West River, it's a big river. We also,
What does SGA stand for?
Stream Geomorphic Assessment. Should have said that earlier. And then 2 more acronyms for you, RGA and RHA. That's the Rapid Geomorphic Assessment and the Rapid Habitat Assessment. Those are kind of some of the end products. So all of this data goes into a map, which I believe is the next slide. And then it goes into this database. And then within that database, it summarizes everything, spits out summaries for every single reach. All of that is in the appendices of the report, but it's terribly boring and confusing. But all the data's there. And then the RGA and RHA are kind of summary scores that are one nice way to kind of categorize the reach. So the RGA is basically how close is this section of the river to stable, and stable would mean like where it wants to be. Absent of human interaction, how close is this river to what it would want to be doing naturally? And then RHA is how good is the quality of the habitat? And so, and I will talk about those some more later. And then every bridge and culvert, we fill out a separate data sheet and we record the dimensions, we look at the condition, we care a lot about the size of the opening of the structure. And that's one of the things that Irene exposed all over southern Vermont, was that all of these structures that weren't wide enough caused huge problems, more so than just the structure itself, because the river would hit it, it would overtop, it would flow down the road, it would go all kinds of places. And so, and a lot of structures got replaced after Irene, and they got replaced wider, which was very good. And then culverts also have their own special sheet. And culverts, we look at what's called aquatic organism passage. And that is basically, does the culvert represent a stopping point for fish movement in the channel? And there was actually only one culvert in our entire West River study area, which I will talk about later, but that's the picture of the culvert right there. I know it's small, but you can probably tell that that is not good for fish. There's about a 2-foot jump to get into that culvert, and then the culvert's all rusted out on the bottom, so not a good one for fish.
And what is that culvert doing there?
It's cheaper than a bridge.
But does it go under, I mean, it looks like the other end of the culvert.
Oh,
the
the stream turns sharply. It turns sharply to the right on the upstream side. So it's a small stream up there. I will talk about that one a little bit more later.
Yeah, I don't get it, but.
It's carrying a small tributary into the West River.
Yeah, but it's one of the ones that we
Where's the
assessed.
tributary coming from? On the upstream side of it?
Yeah, it bends over away from the trees, but yeah, I might have a map of that one.
Do you see my point? Yeah, it doesn't really matter, you're right.
So
Jim.
I recognize this is really hard to see, but all these maps are in the appendices, probably Appendix C or D. But so this sort of summarizes all the data that we collected in the field. And so we have different color lines that show bank erosion and buffer vegetation. We have circles that show, we have X's that show where there's armoring. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention earlier, the yellow X on that map, every reach we collect at least one cross section, and that's where we actually do a little rough survey of the channel. And that's important for getting the channel dimensions. And that also helps define floodplain accessibility.
When he uses the term armoring, that's
Riprap.
Riprap.
Thank you. So I'm just going to do a quick run through of kind of the different themes and areas that we saw in our assessment. So we did 4 reaches in what we're calling the lower West River. This is the upper West River assessment, but in the lower portion of what we did. So this is all down below the Ball Mountain Dam, above the Townsend Dam. We started right at basically the first spot where there was like not ponded water above the Townsend Dam. So that's kind of where we started. And so down there, the river's huge. You know, it's 180 feet wide. It's pretty flat. And there are just these gigantic dumps of cobbles, small boulders, and gravel from the several tributaries that come in. And so like we went right past where Wardsboro Brook comes in, and there's probably a 10-foot tall mountain of large rock where the stream comes in and then it drops down into the West River. And so all of that material is still just pushing down and pushing into the west. You know, this part's kind of unique because it's not really causing problems downstream because there's a 120-foot tall dam downstream. So, you know, like in other settings that would be more concerning, but there's not a lot of infrastructure. There's one road with about 7 or 8 houses that are kind of on an island that formed in Irene. And that's about it down there. Like otherwise there's not really any bridges. There's not really any roads or houses nearby, which is a good thing because there is just a mountain of sediment moving down the channel. So then we skip upstream probably 4 or 5 miles to get above the effect of the Ball Mountain Dam into what we're calling the central upper West River. And this is the part that flows right through where we're sitting right now. And so this area pretty consistently is where we started to see heavy encroachment. And encroachment is basically, is there something that humans put that is occupying space where the river historically would have gone or could have gone? Because rivers move over long time frames. Rivers move quite a bit side to side, but once we build a railroad on one side and a road on the other side, that river is now effectively a canal. You know, like it can't move anymore. And if it does try to move, we come in and we fix it and we put it back where it needs to go because there's now critical infrastructure. So, you know, this whole stretch, you know, one or two roads or one road and a rail bed were present pretty much throughout. And there were a few places where there was more than 50 feet between the edge of the water and some type of permanent encroachment feature. There was also a lot of bedrock through here. And so, a lot of these channels, when these roads were put in, they used to wind back and forth a little bit. This never would have been a wide valley with beavers and the river snaking back and forth, because it was only about 300 feet wide before we put roads and shrunk it down to 100 feet wide. But it would have historically moved some back and forth, and that helps dissipate energy. That gives you places to deposit sediment and debris, and now it is just a chute. And then getting up closer to Weston, this is all below, this is kind of the top of Londonderry and then below the Weston Dam. There are some floodplains, not many, but there is also a lot less encroachment. So that, the valley is naturally fairly narrow. The river can't move around that much, but it is able to move around some. And you start to see gravel bars forming and things like that. And that is a spot where the river can deposit some of the sediment that's working down. And usually when you have a gravel bar, you also then have a pool and you start to get some more habitat. And you start to have the river, so the bottom left picture, there's some bank erosion there, which is not always a bad thing. That shows that the channel is moving. When the channel is moving, it's dissipating energy. And then the bottom right, you have some wood that's falling into the channel. And you're starting to get just a little bit more, not natural, but better looking features. And then,
why do you say that's not natural?
because it has still been heavily, in the 1800s, they went crazy and they straightened all of these rivers. They dug them out, they dredged them. River dredging was very prevalent until fairly recently. And so,
I remember in 1973, we had a significant event, and the solution was to drive bulldozers down the middle of the river.
Yep. And that helped some areas, but it caused some real problems for everyone downstream. And so, that was a good question. So someone, for those of you on Zoom, someone commented that after was it 73? Okay. There was a big flood, not Irene big, but close to Irene big in the 70s. It was a statewide Vermont flood. And that was kind of the last flood where the response was do what the Army Corps of Engineers does, which is just bulldoze everything, hog out the rivers, pile it all up along the side of the rivers, and it will take centuries to overcome that. That was the way of thinking for a long time. It also enabled people to build in places where we now know might not have been a good place to build. So this is starting basically right at the Weston Playhouse, the Weston Dam, and then going upstream to the top of what we studied. And so once you get maybe a mile upstream of the dam, you get into a really wide, slow, winding setting. There's beaver dams, the road's not getting flooded. There's a lot of opportunity, which we will talk about later. There's a lot of opportunity to enhance and store water, which will benefit all of the downstream communities. Up until this point, we actually were kind of a little displeased with the lack of solutions that we were seeing. And finally, when we got up here, we started to see something that looked promising. But we started to see, the picture that's me walking across a diagonal bar, which is a gravel bar that cuts across the channel diagonally. Those are a major indicator of lots of sediment being stored in the channel, which is generally a good thing. In this case, a good thing. And beaver dams too. Beavers are contentious, but they do help a lot. And in this system where your floodplains are all really high and hard to get to, beaver dams help alleviate that. Till they break. Yes. So now I'm going to get into some of the tributaries we worked on. So we did a short stretch on the Winhall River, kind of up in the middle of the watershed, and I actually haven't seen really much of the rest of it other than down in the lower portion where it follows the road. But the Winhall River got obliterated in Irene. And the stretch that we were working on, the river change the channel location, 6, 7 times. And so it would just completely jump and then cut a 40-foot wide swath through the trees. And then that would get plugged up, and then it would jump again, and then it would jump again. And so just super, super active. But because it did all that, it also stored a huge amount of the material, the logs, the rocks that would have otherwise washed downstream. So it's actually a very good thing that that happened. But it was a really, really interesting area. And that's up in the National Forest. You can get right to it, but you got to drive on some pretty bumpy dirt roads. So this is T12's Thompsonburg Brook. That comes in very close to here. I think it's on this road, isn't it? Yeah, it's just down. Yeah, yeah. And so this one kind of had a bit of all of it. The lower portion was pretty steep and had a lot of bedrock, and then it got into a long stretch that was pinned by the road and had a lot of riprap, and then it got into an area that had some agricultural fields and some floodplain, and then up in the top it started to look pretty good with a lot of trees and pools and better habitat. And then Flood Brook, and then the tributary to it, Farnham Brook. They were mostly way out in the woods, but you actually did see some evidence of historic berming, probably from the 70s floods, because they had some big maple trees growing on them. This channel was quite active. It had a lot of what we call meander development. That's where the river is starting to carve bends into the valley, which is good. It helps with stabilization and energy dissipation over time. And then the last one is Utley Brook. This is the one that comes in right in downtown Londonderry. The stretch, I'm blanking on the name right now, but the first bridge on that channel is a nice swimming hole right on that bridge. But the area downstream of there was another place where in Irene, the channel just broke free and it carved a whole second channel and a third channel, busted through some beaver dams, deposited tons and tons of sediment. And that's critical because if that hadn't happened, all those rocks would have ended up in the West River, right in the area where the West River jumped out and caused the worst flooding damage. So like that's a really important floodplain area also. Okay, moving on. Let me catch up because I know I had a couple notes here that I wanted to talk about. I recognize that you probably can't see any of this, so I'll be quick. One of the frustrating things that I have with the stream geomorphic method is that the final scoring breaks down into poor, fair, and good. Well, and excellent, but excellent doesn't happen. And so almost everything is always just fair. It's just everything is fair, even like the nicest stretches. And so what we've done is we broke fair into fair good and fair poor. We just split it in the middle, because then you actually get some color. Because if I just did red, orange, and green, the entire map would be orange other than one green and one red. I think two reds and one green. And so, like breaking it into fair good and fair poor at least lets you kind of get an idea of what's going on. But like it is really hard to get goods. And I've seen one excellent ever.
Looks like there's a tiny little bit of good.
There's one good. Yes, there is one good.
What's the purple line?
That's the watershed boundary. So, and so, like some of the things that drove these scores is that there was a real lack of wood in these channels, way less than you would expect or want to see. And that part of that, I mean, you definitely see chainsawed, a tree falls across the channel. Even if it's in the middle of nowhere, there's no access anywhere, someone comes through and chainsaws it. And so, and then that breaks it free and then it floats downstream. And so.
Do you want to just take half a minute and
Yeah.
say why wood is important?
Okay, so, and this is really, the state has been really kind of putting out information about this recently. So wood in a channel, especially wood in a stream where there isn't infrastructure right there, is always good. It helps slow the water down. It helps raise the channel elevation some, which then makes floodplain more accessible. And one big tree that falls across the channel catches more trees as they flow downstream, which those trees could have become problems further down. Any spot where you get wood that falls across the channel, it usually scours out a pool behind it, so you pick up fish habitat. And it can also help the channels redevelop, kind of overcome some of the historic work that's happened to them and start to carve new bends and further dissipate energy. And so there's a new kind of hot buzzword. The strategic wood addition is the new buzzword. And that is basically coming through, and especially if you're in a place where there's no infrastructure, you just start cutting trees and dropping them into the channel. And you just sort of let them fall where they fall. You try to put them in the right spot, but you don't do anything. You're not cabling them down. You're not anchoring them with stone. You're just chopping trees down and dropping them in the channel. And landowners and land managers can also accomplish that by not clearing wood out that isn't causing a problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, one important exception to that is that when you have culverts downstream that are undersized, one tree that turns sideways in a storm, your culvert's gone. And so that's kind of where it gets a little bit tricky. Yeah, question?
Did you happen to walk the flood brook down towards where it meets the West River?
No. Nope.
There is a magnificent, unimpeded floodplain down there, where
Is
the brook has split and moved and overtopped. I live right there. I'd love to give you a tour.
So that area was done in the previous assessment. Bear Creek did all of Flood Brook that we didn't do.
Yeah, we did one.
So, yeah. So that would have been done, I don't know if it's changed, and that was done in 2013, I think. So it's,
Right after
changed.
yeah,
Yeah.
you should take Marie, check it out.
So Joe, when questions come up for the benefit of
Oh,
our
yes.
online,
Sorry.
can you just repeat the question?
Yes, that was a question from the audience about whether or not we walked a specific part of Flood Brook that looked really nice, and no, we did not. What we did looked nice, but we did not do your nice part. And then, yeah, it might have been green. It might have been green. And then the geomorphic stability. This is the RGA. Once again, we split it into yellow and orange for fair good and fair poor, because otherwise it would just all be orange. It's pretty bad. And this one, the West River watershed really gets dinged in this assessment for the encroachment. And then I'm also going to talk about, so the historic straightening and road encroachment are really what are driving this. And then I don't think I've used the term incision yet. So incision's a really important term in this world. And that is effectively how accessible is the floodplain. And so in a channel that isn't incised, the 1 inch rainstorm, 2 inch rainstorm, the channel is actually going to spill over its banks and go out into the floodplain. And in an incised channel, it might need to be a 5-year, a 10-year, and then in a really incised channel, you're looking at the 25, 50-year storm before you're actually leaving the channel. And otherwise, all of that water is just staying right in the drainage canal and blasting downstream.
Basically, it means that the bed of the stream keeps eroding, so it gets lower
Yep.
and lower and lower, which means more and more, it takes more and more water to get out onto the floodplain, because now the channel's real, you dig a hole and the banks fall, right?
Yep.
Eventually you get too deep and everything falls in, and that's what incision is, it just eats
Yep.
away at the bottom.
And that can be a combination of the channel eating downwards and humans building the banks upwards, which in portions of the West, both of those things happened. So that's, and especially when it digs all the way down and hits bedrock, it's basically stuck there forever. Like the river, it can't do anything to fix itself unless we do significant intervention. And then, up in the tributaries, we started to see the other steps in the stream geomorphic process. So when a channel digs down way too deep, basically its only option is to either build the bed back up, and that's called aggradation. But for that to happen, you need things like wood, or you need really big rocks that aren't going to move in the next storm, or human intervention. And then the other option is widening, and that is when basically the channel's so deep that gravity starts to take over and the banks start failing, and then the channel can start to cut outwards. And then the last step is plan form adjustment, and that is when the channel starts to cut its own bends back again. And we did start to see widening and plan form adjustment in several of the tributaries, not really in the West River, except for one small area up in Weston, which I will talk about shortly. So I know you can't see this map at all, but it's in the report. We have a 24 by 36 map in the report. So we identified 65 projects, 60 projects. So this is just as we are walking, if we see a spot where we think there is an opportunity for a restoration project. And some of these are really small, some of these are multi-million-dollar projects. And we kind of split those up into 3 categories. One is infrastructure resiliency, and those are, at least for the West River, pretty boring. That's basically like this power pole is about to erode and fall into the river. This riprap along Route 100 is failing. And those are not very exciting projects, but we log them anyways, because especially VTrans wants to know when we find something that they can fix before the guardrail starts falling into the river. And then passive restoration projects are basically projects where you don't need to have more studies, you don't need to have more measurements. That's things like buffer planting, floodplain protection easements, that sort of stuff, where basically like we can pass this off to Marie and Margot and they can go talk to the private landowner if it's on private land. They can work out a deal, get some money together to support buffer planting. We plant trees in the buffer, project's done. And then active restoration are things where you need to put more effort into it. So that's things like bridge replacements, culvert replacements, channel, channel bench cuts, which we'll talk about shortly, like kind of bigger projects. It's not quite like things that require an excavator and things that don't require an excavator, but that is one way to think about it. So I'm going to zip through these because we're running out of time here. So, these are examples of the infrastructure resiliency projects. They're not very sexy. It's like the bank armoring's falling, is eroding. And then have we did find lots of areas where there is a lacking or like a reduced or completely absent riparian buffer. And riparian buffers are important for a lot of reasons, but one major thing is that with no roots there, if you only have grass and ferns growing, that does nothing to slow erosion. Whereas if you can actually grow in some shrubs and some trees, it doesn't stop erosion, but slows erosion. And as the bank erodes, things fall into the channel that provide useful habitat. If it's just a hayfield, it's just dirt and nutrients falling into the channel. So we found several buffer planting projects. Come on. And then some of the bigger projects were channel and floodplain management, and some of these I will talk about in the next section. But some of these are, like this is an area that's just kind of back in the woods, but there's a really important floodplain. And if you can there are various ways to get an easement on that property, like Vermont River Conservancy and things like that. And so that way it just ensures that future management of the land is not going to impact the function of the floodplain. And then there were also some spots where a floodplain was bermed off, and you can either remove the berm completely or knock a few holes in the berm, and that then establishes a floodplain pretty low cost. And then we did find one spot where somebody had done some questionably legal filling of a floodplain. And also we found sometimes you find just old armor from old, previous land uses where there's now nothing going on there, and that armor is stopping the channel from moving and impeding floodplain access. And so you can just come in and scoop the armor out, plant some trees behind it, and let the river do what it wants to do. Here we go.
Yeah.
Yes, there's the one culvert. It's on Batchelder's Barn Road in Peru, and it scored out really bad. It was way too small and perched and in bad condition.
It's amazing that you only found that.
Only one.
That's amazing.
We had 33 bridges, and so bank full width is sort of, it's a calculation of what's an appropriate stable width of an opening on a bridge to not cause major problems during a flood. And more than half of them were smaller than bank full, but not too many of them were way smaller than bank full, far better than most watersheds that I've worked in. And I think part of it was that Irene came through and removed the worst offenders. And then they got built back with bigger structures. So we noticed the same thing in the Williams River watershed, where you saw a lot of new concrete and shiny guardrails in spots that used to have a bad bridge. And only one or two of the ones that we looked at really did look to be like a major problem for flooding.
Excuse me,
Yep,
could you go back to that last slide?
with the culvert or this one?
That one where it says Thompsonburg Road.
Oh, sorry, I went, okay.
Yeah, I actually live at the other end of Thompsonburg Road, and I did see your little map will have like little
Yeah.
purple stars on it. So I was wondering if you could explain what that means, and when you said Thompsonburg Road, 43% and 62%, what is that?
That is the percentage of the bank full width. And so, you know, like ideally you'd want to see, it's basically like if the channel is 20 feet wide, that means that the bridge opening is only 8 feet wide or 11 feet wide.
Right,
And
and which bridges are you?
that is all in the report. I can't get to that information right now, but that is all,
Okay,
that is all in the report.
Which bridges you're referring to.
Yeah. Okay, let me keep bugging. And so this was, there's an elevated floodplain. It's an abandoned hayfield. It hasn't been agriculture in quite a while. Supposedly there is actually a leach field for the restaurant that is located on that field, and they force main it under the channel. But if and when the sewer project is complete and they're no longer using that leach field, then this would be an excellent place to restore a fairly large floodplain. But that would require cutting that whole area down several feet, because right now that hayfield is basically at the same elevation as the parking lots across the street. So it's only being used as a floodplain when the businesses are underwater. So, you know, it would require a lot of earth moving, but that could be a pretty valuable floodplain. And the fact that it's located at a confluence with a fairly large stream that's carrying a lot of sediment makes it even more important. There's some more diagrams. This is the same project. It just sort of shows like what our cut would look like. And, you know, basically like we're trying to cut it so that at about the 10-year flood, water is starting to get out onto that floodplain. And the floodplain would also be planted with, you know, tree species so that it would slow down water, trap debris, trap sediment. The next project is similar. This is just up from the Weston Dam, across from the general store gas station that was a FEMA buyout, and from some other places that got across from the old fire station. Same deal. You can see it on this slide. So the hatched area is what's ground now, and the elevation of the hayfield is higher or at the same elevation as the front doors of all those buildings. So just another spot to cut it. And that is all, it's private land, but it's all one landowner, and they have a really big property. So, you know, if they're willing to work with it, it could be a cool spot. And that was really important because there's not a lot of floodplain between Weston and Londonderry. So like it's important to get whatever you can there. Once you get further upstream from here, there starts to be more floodplain. This project, one important note though, is that if the Weston Dam comes out, the channel is going to revert to a much lower elevation. So, you know, like you don't just cut out a dam and let the channel turn into a canyon and blast all that stuff. Usually they'd step it up with some, you know, rock structures or something. But this one is careful consideration for the future of the Weston Dam, because that's a tall dam, and this would be a very different setting with that dam gone. Next up, so this is on the West River, further upstream in Weston. It's Kyle Road and Stevens Loop, if you know where that is. That's the first like actual
Where's
nice.
north on that?
North is left, yeah.
Okay.
Yep, sorry, yep.
It's up towards the Western Priory.
Yes,
Yep.
yes. And that's it's a really nice floodplain. The channel's starting to move. There's some beavers in there. There's not a lot, because of the beavers and also because it used to be a hayfield, there's really nothing other than, you know, grasses and goldenrod and ferns growing in there. But this is a really good spot where the channel could start to access the floodplain better. This will be a good one for strategic wood additions. The roads are all elevated nice and high, so there wouldn't be a conflict if the channel was maybe 2 feet higher and then therefore was accessing the floodplain more easily. So this one, kind of buffer plantings, possibility of raising the bed up, conserving the whole area to make sure that it doesn't change landowners and become a cornfield. Something like that. Details for that one's kind of boring. And then this is the gigantic area that talked about before on the Winhall River. Can't see anything in here, but it's just a massive floodplain. Needs to all be, it's mostly in the national forest, but not all of it. And then there were also a couple water quality projects at the edge of the hayfield there, which is enrolled in Vermont Land Trust. I know you can't see anything on that one, but that is all in the report. And there's also one of the forest roads had some water bars that just discharged directly into the river, which we recommended some improvements for that. I'll skip that. I'm almost done. And then this is another one that is on Farnham Brook. And similar to that previous one on West River, the channel's moving and it'd be a really good spot to raise the bed a little bit. There's no infrastructure conflicts. There's also a much smaller stream that cuts through the property that has no buffer at all, and it does look like it occasionally is pastured, so there's just cows in the stream. So it'll be a really good spot to get some vegetation growing, put up cattle exclusion, just barbed wire or electric fence to keep the cows out of the stream, and mostly water quality benefits, some flood benefits. And then there's also, they have a water access for the cows directly into the channel. And there are some designs from the NRCS of sort of how you can maintain a cow water access, but have it be not erosive and not getting sediment nutrients into the channel. And then I believe it's on to conclusions, come on. Yeah, so overall conclusions and recommendations, and then we're done. We've covered most of this, but the West River, the main theme of our study area on the upper West River is that there are very few floodplains that are accessible at all, and those that are accessible are generally pretty high up in elevation, so it needs to be a big flood to get out onto it. Large portions of what we studied is incised, and it's pretty much permanent because we're not going to move Route 100, we're not going to move all of these buildings. So there are a bunch of areas where unfortunately there's really nothing that can be done to make them better. But if you can improve the areas outside of those, you can stop them from getting worse. I put dam removal question mark on that one. That wasn't really part of our scope of our study, but I know that is a big issue in this area, or the two dams. And any work on those dams will affect pretty large stretches upstream and shorter stretches downstream of each dam. We really didn't see many areas of what we call instability, so that's channel migration, bank erosion, that kind of stuff. A lot of that is because the river is pinned and armored, but we just didn't see much evidence of that. And as I said before, like the structures, there were some bridges that were narrower than ideal, but really nothing looked too egregious. And then for flood resiliency, the whole study area has been mapped by the feds fairly recently. The flood maps actually looked pretty good. And other watersheds after Irene, the actual channel blasted outside of the mapped 100-year floodplain. The channel completely moved, and so obviously those needed to be updated. There have been some buyouts. There certainly can be more, and when there are buyouts, those also can be opportunities to add a floodplain where there used to be an at-risk house. Up in the tributaries, there were sort of different observations. We started to see more channel movement, more sediment storage, some better habitat, different types of projects to improve the situation up there. And then I think that was it for that one.
Speak to NFIP mapping.
Sorry, that's the National Flood Insurance Program mapping. And so those were on those two slides I had. Sorry, what was that?
Is it FEMA related?
Yes, it is FEMA. And large portions of Vermont were only mapped in the 70s and 80s and the early 90s and haven't been mapped again since then. So it's only black lines on a black sheet of paper, and this whole area was mapped with modern standards and is much more accurate, which is good. And then, sort of rehashing some of the town-specific recommendations. both Weston and Londonderry, there's Dam, which they're both being considered for removal. People that know a lot more about it have written reports on them. And then, fairly limited floodplain areas in Londonderry, some in Weston. And then, Weston had a lot of opportunities for buffer improvements, less so in Londonderry because there's not a lot of room for buffers. And then in the smaller towns that we didn't have too much work in, common themes were riparian buffers and then protecting and improving floodplain.